A wealthy businessman forgot his own children at school for 2 whole hours. 2 little boys sat on a cold bench in an empty hallway, waiting for a father who never came. But the person who finally showed up wasn't family. She was their housekeeper, and what she did next would change this family forever in ways nobody could have predicted. This is a story about a woman who had nothing but gave everything, a father who had everything but gave nothing, and 2 little boys caught in the middle. But I have to warn you, if you watch this until the end, you might need some tissues. Before we dive into this incredible story, if you believe that love isn't about status or money, but about showing up when it matters, hit that subscribe button right now. Drop a comment telling me, have you ever been forgotten by someone who should have remembered you? And smash that like button, because this story deserves to be heard by everyone who's ever felt invisible. Now, let's begin. Richard Harrison had forgotten his sons at school. When he finally arrived at Wellington Academy, he stopped at the top of the entrance stairs, frozen. His 2 boys weren't running toward him. They were running toward Sarah, the housekeeper, who stood at the bottom of the steps with 2 ice cream cones in her hands. The name coming out of those little mouths wasn't Dad. It was Sarah. And that single moment broke something inside Richard that he didn't even know was still intact. But let me take you back 2 hours earlier, because that's when everything truly began. Sarah had been cleaning the kitchen windows when her phone rang. The caller ID showed Wellington Academy. She answered on the second ring. "Miss Sarah, this is the front office at Wellington. We've been trying to reach Mr. Harrison for over an hour. Matthew and David are still here. School ended at 3 o'clock. It's now past 5 o'clock. Sarah felt her stomach drop. "He didn't pick them up." "No, ma'am. We've called his cell phone 3 times. No answer." Sarah didn't hesitate. She didn't stop to think whether this was part of her job description. She didn't wait to see if someone more qualified would handle it. 3 unanswered calls were answer enough. She grabbed her purse from the kitchen hook, sent a quick text to her neighbor asking to borrow her car, and walked out the service door with the keys already in her hand. Her heart wasn't beating with fear. It was beating with urgency. The kind of urgency that appears when someone knows exactly what needs to be done and finds no real reason to delay. The school was 20 minutes away in Boston traffic. Sarah made it in 14 because she caught the right lights, and because there was a determination in her body that left no room for hesitation. When she walked through the front office door, the receptionist stood up from behind the counter with visible relief on her face. Thank God someone came. Sarah walked straight to the hallway where the 2 boys were sitting. Matthew, the 10-year-old, was on the left side of the bench. His hands were folded in his lap, his eyes fixed on the floor. His jaw was slightly clenched, the way older children do when they're holding something inside that they don't want to release in front of strangers. In that moment, he looked like someone who had already learned that expecting too much only leads to disappointment. David, the younger one, was on the right, his backpack clutched against his chest, his small feet swinging because they couldn't reach the floor. Every time a sound came from the hallway, his head turned toward the door with that hopeful expectation that only young children have, the belief that the person they're waiting for will appear the next time the door opens. When David saw Sarah walk in, he dropped his backpack and jumped off the bench in one motion. Sarah lowered herself before he reached her. She opened her arms wide, and he crashed into her embrace with the full weight of his little body, holding nothing back, measuring nothing. He just went. Matthew took longer. He stayed on the bench, watching for a moment. Then he stood up slowly and walked toward her. When he got close, Sarah placed one arm around him, without forcing, without squeezing too hard. She just placed it there, and he stayed without pulling away, his forehead almost touching her shoulder, breathing deeply just once. That single breath said everything he wasn't going to say out loud. Sarah stayed wrapped around both boys for a long time. She felt their weight against her body, smelled the school day on them, the lunch stored in backpacks since morning, the chalk dust, the sweat of children who had waited too long in a place that wasn't meant for waiting. She didn't say anything because there was nothing to say that the embrace wasn't already communicating with more precision than any words she could choose. When she finally released them, she adjusted Matthew's backpack strap on his shoulder with both hands, checked the zipper on David's bag, thanked the receptionist who was still watching with quiet curiosity, and said only 2 words, "Let's go." There was no anger in that phrase, no accusation, no weight of any kind. It was just the voice of someone who was there and who was going to keep being there. The two boys heard that and walked on either side of her, David holding the edge of her apron without even realizing he was doing it. In the car, David stared out the window with wide eyes, as if the journey was something new. Sarah had learned to recognize this trait in him. It was the most honest part of his personality. Matthew sat quietly on the other side, his backpack on his lap, even though there was space on the seat beside him. He stared out of the window, not like a child looking at scenery, but like someone processing something in silence that wasn't ready to become conversation yet. Sarah drove slowly, checking on both boys through the rearview mirror at every turn. There was a tension in her body that she couldn't completely release, because she knew that when they got home, she would have to face a situation that wasn't simple. She wasn't the guardian of these children. She was an employee of that house. There was a line between those two things, and she had crossed it without permission. She didn't regret it one bit, but she knew she would have to answer for it. Near the mansion, as the car was turning onto their street, Matthew spoke without taking his eyes off the window. "Did you know we were there?" Sarah looked at him through the rearview mirror. "The school called me." "But you didn't have to come." She didn't respond immediately. She parked the car in front of the gate, took the key from the ignition, sat for a second with her hands on the steering wheel, and then turned slightly to look at him. "Nobody's going to sit waiting while I can do something about it." Matthew looked at her through the mirror for a second that was longer than the others. Then he opened the door and got out without saying anything more. But there was something different in the way he moved, in the way he adjusted his backpack on his shoulder and waited for David. Sarah noticed that and stored it away without comment. "Where are you watching from tonight? Let me know in the comments below. I love seeing where our stories travel." Inside the mansion, Sarah prepared a quick snack and sat the boys at the kitchen table. She made hot chocolate for David, who had fallen asleep in the car and woken up groggy. Then she went to the freezer and pulled out 2 ice cream cones because it was Friday and because that day had been too long to end without something good. Matthew ate his ice cream slowly, with excessive attention, licking the edges of the cone as if keeping his mouth busy so he wouldn't have to use it for anything else. David ate while laughing, ice cream sliding down his wrist, not caring at all. He was the type of child who lived inside the moment without carrying the weight of what had happened before or what might happen next. Sarah stood leaning against the kitchen counter, watching them, thinking that there was something very wrong in this house that had nothing to do with the cleaning she did every day. There was silence in the wrong places. The house was big and well-maintained, but there was a silence in its corners that wasn't peace. It was absence. And the children carried this silence in their bodies in a way that Sarah recognized because she had grown up around similar silences and knew exactly how heavy they were. Richard arrived 40 minutes later. Sarah heard the car, the door slam, the footsteps on the stone walkway. She went out to the courtyard with both boys at her side because she had decided she wasn't going to wait to be called. The boys still had their ice cream cones. Matthew's was almost finished. David's was half eaten, melting down the cone. Richard climbed the steps, briefcase in hand, his suit jacket buttoned as always. He stopped when he saw them, frozen at the top of the staircase for a time that was long enough for everyone to notice. Then he descended slowly, one step at a time. When he got close, David went to him, hugged his leg quickly with the ice cream cone still in hand, staining the suit pants without noticing, and then returned to Sarah's side immediately, as if he had fulfilled a protocol and could now go back to where he wanted to be. Matthew didn't move. He stayed where he was, ice cream in hand, looking at his father with an expression that wasn't anger, because anger would still have heat. What was on Matthew's face was colder than that. It was the look of a child who had learned not to expect too much. Richard saw all of this. He stood in the courtyard, looked at his sons, looked at Sarah, and there was something different on his face. It was something more open, less protected, like someone being reached by a reality that had been kept outside for too long. "I know I was late," he said, his voice low, without the executive weight it normally carried. Matthew looked at him with eyes that didn't blink. 2 hours, Dad. We sat there for 2 hours. Richard closed his eyes for a second, just 1 second, then opened them. He turned his gaze to Sarah. "Thank you." She didn't respond. It wasn't the moment. She picked up the boys' backpacks, handed one to each, and said she was going to prepare dinner. She turned her back and entered the mansion without hurry and without drama. And as she crossed the hallway, she could hear the silence that had remained outside between Richard and the boys. That silence was heavier and more honest than any argument. That night, after the boys were asleep, Richard went to the kitchen. Sarah was finishing up at the sink when she heard him. He was without his jacket, his shirt slightly unbuttoned at the collar. He seemed smaller, like just a tired man in a large kitchen who didn't know how to begin. "You didn't have to go get them," he said. Sarah dried her hands on the dish towel, folded it carefully, and placed it on the edge of the sink. "I know." "Then why did you go?" She looked at him with a clarity that held no judgment, only answer. "Because they were alone and I could go. Didn't need any more reason than that." Richard was quiet for a while after she said that. Then he said, his voice still low, "This won't happen again." Sarah picked up her jacket and walked toward the door. As she passed him, he said her name with a firmness that wasn't an employer's tone. She stopped, but didn't turn immediately. "Sarah, this won't happen again." She turned, looked at him for 2 full seconds, and left without responding, because there were things that only time could prove, and she had learned long ago that words spoken at night in a kitchen needed daylight to confirm if they were true. In the following days, something changed in the rhythm of that house. Richard started coming home earlier, not every day, not perfectly, but with a frequency that simply hadn't existed before. On Tuesday, he arrived at 6 p.m. and went straight to the boys' room. On Thursday, he arrived at 5:30 and sat with them for dinner. He stayed until the end, his phone face down on the table. When David knocked over his glass of juice, Richard didn't get that tense expression he always had. He simply grabbed a napkin and cleaned it up with his son. Sarah served, cleared, and said nothing, but she observed everything. She knew that real changes don't announce themselves with speeches. They appear in small gestures. One Wednesday afternoon, while Sarah was mopping the second-floor hallway, Richard almost tripped over the bucket. He apologized in a natural voice, without irritation. When she stood up, he was still standing there, looking at her in a way that was different. It wasn't the look of someone checking if the work was done. It was the look of someone seeing a person with real attention. "How long have you worked here?" The question came with genuine curiosity. 2 years and 3 months. "Do you have family here in Boston?" "I have my mother. Just her." "Just her." He nodded slowly, storing the information, and went back to his study. Sarah continued mopping, but there was something different in the air. A question that didn't have a shape yet, but was definitely there. Weeks later, Richard called Sarah into the living room. He was sitting on the sofa, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. There was a seriousness on his face that wasn't an employer's seriousness. "Sit," he said. The invitation to sit on that sofa had never happened before in 2 years and 3 months. Sarah sat on the edge of an armchair and waited. "I want to tell you something," he began. "The boy's mother left a year and 4 months ago. It was a departure she chose for reasons I understand, but the boys can't understand yet. And I've been failing them in a way that I know I'm failing, and I still haven't figured out how to stop." Sarah looked at him. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you do more for them than I do. And I needed you to know that I see that I'm not blind to what's happening inside my own house." Sarah was quiet for a few necessary seconds, then said, "Richard, I take care of your house because it's my job and because I genuinely care about those boys. But what they need isn't me. It's you, and you know that." He kept looking at her, and there was something on his face she hadn't seen before. It wasn't shame. It wasn't anger. It was the face of someone being reached by words that had gone deep without asking permission. That same week, Richard started waking up earlier to take the boys to school himself. He started having dinner with them every night without his phone. On Friday, he came home with a new soccer ball and called Matthew to play in the garden. Matthew went, at first with caution, and then with the speed and noise that a 10-year-old boy has when he finally forgets to hold back. David stayed on the porch, shouting and laughing, happy just to be watching. Sarah saw all of this from the kitchen window, and it left a lightness in her chest that she wasn't used to feeling within those walls. Matthew started smiling more. Not the polite smile, but the involuntary one that appeared at the corner of his mouth without warning. That was the only kind of smile that couldn't be faked. On a Saturday afternoon, Sarah was in the garden collecting clothes from the clothesline when Richard came over with 2 glasses of juice. He extended one to her. She accepted. They stood side by side, looking at the garden with the sound of the boys playing in the background. "Have you ever thought about studying?" he asked, direct and honest. Sarah took a sip. "I've thought about it. Haven't had the means yet." "What did you want to study?" She paused. It had been a long time since anyone had asked. "Nursing." Richard kept looking at the garden. "I can help you with that." Sarah turned to him. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to, but I want to." There was a real and clear difference between those two things, and both of them were aware of it. "Let me think about it," she said. He didn't insist. He left, and she stayed in the garden a while longer, her head full of an answer that was already prepared. "I accept," she said quietly to herself before turning off the light in the laundry room. The next morning, she waited for the right moment. After Richard dropped the boys at school and returned, he found her in the laundry room. She said she accepted his offer to help with her studies, but that she wanted everything clear and direct. A defined payment for college, set schedules, no misplaced promises or hidden expectations. He agreed to every point. When he gave her the receipt for the evening nursing program, he just placed the envelope on the kitchen table and said, "Everything is arranged." She opened it, checked the documents, and put them in her purse. She just thanked him with a look that lasted longer than usual and went back to cutting vegetables for dinner. But both of them knew that in that instant, a rare trust had been established between them. With college starting, the routine changed. Sarah left in the late afternoon, taking 2 buses to campus. Richard reorganized his schedule to be home before 8 p.m. most nights. He sat at the table with his sons, helping David with his soup, checking Matthew's multiplication tables. He saw with clarity how much he had missed. The tooth that fell out, the new nicknames, Matthew's nervous habits. Sarah had seen all of this. He hadn't. This realization hurt, but this time, the pain didn't paralyze him. It made him pay more attention. One evening, David looked at his father and asked if he was going to forget about the school presentation next week. Richard's fork stopped midair. He put it down, looked directly at his son, and said firmly that he wouldn't forget. David asked if it was a real promise. Richard said it was. Matthew then looked up and said quietly, "This time we'll wait to see." Richard accepted it without defending himself. He understood that recovering a child's trust was harder than closing any business deal. May your family be blessed with health, peace, and prosperity. Sarah's new life was exhausting. She worked all day, ran to class, and came back late to study. Richard started waiting up for her. At first, they just talked about the day. Then the conversations got longer. He asked about her classes. She told him about a strict professor, a group project. He listened with genuine attention. In return, he sometimes talked about his own day, about wrong decisions, about the discomfort of realizing how long he had distanced himself from his own life. The boys were the first to notice the change between them. One night, Matthew stood watching his father clean the kitchen. "Are you happy?" he asked. Richard knelt to get closer to his son's height. "I'm trying to be." "Lately, it seems like you're succeeding," Matthew said. Then he asked, "Does Sarah have anything to do with it?" Richard didn't smile or look away. He answered simply, "She's good for the whole house." Matthew nodded slowly and before going upstairs said, "You can tell." The first real tension came from Richard's family. His older sister Laura, an elegant woman used to controlling everything, arrived for Sunday lunch. She noticed the different atmosphere immediately, the way Richard played with the boys, the way he sought Sarah's eyes. Later, she found Sarah alone and commented that misinterpreted relationships could bring problems for everyone. Sarah understood the message. She looked directly at Laura and responded, "The only problem in that house started long before I arrived, when the people who should have taken care of the boys were too busy to notice what was happening with them." There was no raised voice, just truth. That night, Richard found out what happened. The next day, he called his sister and made it clear that Sarah deserved respect. It was the first time he had defended her out of feeling, not politeness. When he told Sarah, she just said she didn't want to be a reason for fighting. Richard replied, "It wasn't a fight, it was a boundary." Sarah kept that sentence with more care than she let on. One night, after a particularly difficult exam, Sarah came home looking worn out. Richard was waiting. "I'm tired of being strong all the time," she said, her voice low. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He pulled up a chair and said, You don't need to be strong all the time here." They sat in silence until she said she was afraid of failing, of not being able to handle it all. Richard listened and responded with a calm she hadn't known in him before. He said that if she wanted to stop, he would respect it, but as long as she wanted to continue, he would be by her side so she wouldn't have to carry everything alone. There was no declaration of love, but there was something more serious. The situation became more delicate when Victoria, the boy's mother, started reaching out again. Richard became distressed, and Sarah noticed. He told her Victoria wanted to reconnect. Sarah listened, then said that presence couldn't be a test, and that if Victoria truly wanted to get closer, it had to be at the children's pace, not hers. It was that night that Richard understood the magnitude of her dignity. She could have acted with jealousy or fear. Instead, she chose to protect the children. The first meeting with Victoria at a cafe was a disaster. She tried to be affectionate too quickly. David didn't know how to react. Matthew shut down. When they got home, Matthew went straight to his room. Sarah went up and found him sitting on his bed. He asked if it was wrong to be angry at his own mother. Sarah said what was wrong was pretending not to feel anything. Then Matthew said the worst part wasn't the anger, it was the fear of getting excited and then being disappointed again. Sarah told him no one would force him to feel trust before he was ready. Then she promised him, "I'm not going to leave your lives like someone turning off a light and closing a door." The boy's shoulders relaxed for the first time since he'd come back. The following meetings with Victoria were more careful, but the tension remained. It was during this period that Sarah's presence became even more essential. She made the house function without the boys feeling abandoned. Richard began to observe this daily care with an admiration that no longer fit within the word gratitude. He loved her, but he held that love with responsibility because he knew it wasn't enough to feel. He needed to be ready to sustain it. The confirmation came on an ordinary Wednesday. Richard came home and found David drawing at the kitchen table, Matthew reading at the counter, and Sarah chopping vegetables while explaining the difference between an artery and a vein to the older boy. There was life in that kitchen, simple, real life. David showed his father his drawing. 4 people holding hands. He pointed to himself, his brother, his father, and finally to the female figure wearing an apron. Richard looked at the drawing for a few seconds longer than normal. Matthew noticed, got off his stool, and said, "For me, it's like that too." Sarah stood still, the knife resting on the cutting board. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was truth. Richard stored that paper in his work folder. Later, alone in his office, he looked at the drawing again and knew he could no longer delay his own life. The declaration happened weeks later, with the maturity the moment required. After the boys were asleep, Richard called Sarah to the garden. He said he had waited because he needed to be sure it was real love, not just gratitude. He told her he admired her for who she was, for her courage, for her loyalty. Then he calmly stated that he loved her and that if she didn't feel the same, he would respect that. Sarah took a few seconds. She said she loved him too, but that she wouldn't accept a relationship that put his sons in second place or was based on gratitude. Richard responded that getting close to her was precisely what had made him put his sons at the center of his life for the first time. It was the answer she needed. Months later, Richard proposed in the same courtyard where everything had begun to change. He had 2 ice cream cones, 2 boys watching with bright eyes, and a woman who had once run to pick up 2 forgotten children at school, without imagining she was also running toward her own life. She said yes. Years later, when someone asked Matthew and David when their family story had truly begun to change, both always remembered the same afternoon, the same courtyard, the same school uniforms, and the same 2 ice cream cones in Sarah's hands. If this story touches your heart, please subscribe to support the channel. I'm so curious. Where is everyone tuning in from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. I'd love to see where our community is spread out across the world. And what did you think of the story we just shared? Did any part of it particularly stand out to you? Let me know your thoughts. Wherever you are, I truly hope you are safe and well, wishing you all peace in your day and in your life. Finally, some of the most powerful stories come from you. If you have a story of your own that you think our community needs to hear, please share it with us. We would be honored to listen.